There's a lot of people that will be hyperinsulinemic but normoglycemic. They have normal blood glucose and normal hemoglobin A1C because of very high insulin. That's not metabolically healthy. You know, if you look at their insulin dynamics, they're through the roof. So looking at that person's glucose is not really giving you the whole picture. And I think it's probably the same thing in Alzheimer's. And the trouble with Alzheimer's, though, is that some patients seem to have normal glycemic response, but not in the brain. They're sort of normal glycemic in the body, so sometimes these blood tests don't show what you think they would show. Now, you can have a PET scan and you can actually measure the cerebral uptake of glucose in people in their 30s and 40s. Right. And it's already less than their age-matched peers. And I say peers or controls because these younger people are people that are at risk for Alzheimer's for certain reasons, usually a maternal family history or just a general family history. But so in those people, when they do these studies, they can see that in that young of an age, these people are already starting to have a problem, but I think they're young enough and robust enough that the brain is compensating. They don't have symptoms, so they're asymptomatic. They still have this reduction of cerebral glucose usage, but it's not affecting their day-to-day life. But if they knew at that time that there's already a problem, that's the time to intervene, not when you're 85 and it's too late. You know, I don't think it's ever too late, but that's the canary in the coal mine, you know, is that early problem with glucose usage.
Hello friends, it's Mike Mutzel here. Thanks for tuning back in to another episode. We're live with Amy Berger. She's the author of The Alzheimer's Antidote, and today we're going to talk about blood sugar dysregulation, Alzheimer's disease, and cognitive dysfunction, and really kind of the origin of the brain fuel metabolic disorder, which we now know, as you talk about in your book a lot, Amy, that characterizes Alzheimer's disease, at least one subtype, which I think is really fascinating. So let's kind of launch with kind of this idea that Alzheimer's in traditional diagnoses and so forth is kind of relegated to this disorder that's incurable and treatable. You just have to live with it and there's no real effective medical treatments. But we now know there's so much more going on metabolically that we can ameliorate through diet and lifestyle, right? Yes,
you pretty much said it all. I mean, Alzheimer's disease, at least one significant variant of it. There seem to be a couple of different variants, but the major problem going wrong in the Alzheimer's brain is that neurons in certain regions of the brain lose the ability to use glucose efficiently as a fuel. So it's basically an energy crisis. These cells starve to death. They don't die right away. They start to atrophy. The connections between these neurons kind of enlargen and the synapses atrophy. And the result of that is issues we see in Alzheimer's: memory loss, behavioral disturbances, personality changes, because your brain is literally not being fueled adequately. And it's just like the rest of your body. When you don't have enough energy, you get tired, you get clumsy, you make mistakes you don't normally make. And it's, you know, for a long time, we've kind of been resigned to accepting that there's nothing we can do about Alzheimer's. We don't know what causes it. There's nothing to do about it. You get diagnosed, get your affairs in order, because you will decline. You will probably decline rapidly, and you need to make decisions now that you won't be able to make down the line. And I just think that there's something we can do about this condition. I don't think we are powerless.
There's a lot of great research that you talk about in the book and things like that. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the ketogenic diet, specifically low-carb diet. But so what is causing this brain energy crisis like this? You call this brain fuel metabolic disorder, right? What, like, is it insulin resistance within the neurons, or is there more going on?
Good question. It's not known for certain what's causing it. I mean, we know that there is a problem harnessing energy from glucose in these neurons. We don't really know why. I think, and some of the research seems to indicate, that many of these people are hyperinsulinemic. So over the long term, they do have systemic insulin resistance, but there are some people who don't really have that in the periphery, but they have it in the central nervous system. So if these people were to take a blood test, they might not have chronically high insulin, but in their brain, it's actually a deficit of insulin. They have too little insulin, because insulin does have functions inside the brain. And, you know, insulin is not the only thing that helps use glucose in the brain, but it's one of them. And a lot of these Alzheimer's patients have too little insulin in the central nervous system. So there's definitely some kind of problem with getting glucose into the brain or getting glucose that's in the brain into the cells to be used properly. I think there's a lot of debate about what's causing it. And to be honest, we're not sure. I don't think any researchers are sure. But just like with type 2, so Alzheimer's disease is starting to be called type 3 diabetes. It's all over the medical literature. That's not new. So it has a lot of similarities with type 2. And in type 2, there's a lot of debate, even now, after all these years that it's being researched, there's a lot of debate about what actually causes it. Even if we disagree and we're not sure about the causes, we know what the solution is, right? Or one solution that most of us agree on, low-carb diet. You know, exercise, sleep, different things that help insulin sensitivity, that help glucose metabolism, that help fat metabolism. So I would say the same thing about type 3, the same thing about Alzheimer's. We are not sure what's causing it, but that doesn't mean that we have no answers about what to do about it.
Yeah, very interesting. But I want to go back a little bit to the insulin in the brain and so forth. So we tend to think, and I fell into this mindset prior to reading your book, which is really awesome, by the way. So we'll talk more about that at the end and when it's available and stuff like that. But we hear like, well, if you're insulin resistant or you're diabetic, then that means that you may be predisposed to Alzheimer's. But there's a correlation, but it's not really a causation. So you can have, correct me if I'm wrong, like systemic or central nervous system insulin resistance, but be relatively normal glycemic in the periphery, or what does the research kind of show there?
I guess it depends on what we're talking about, because there's a lot of people that will be hyperinsulinemic but normoglycemic. They have normal blood glucose and normal hemoglobin A1C because of very high insulin. That's not metabolically healthy. You know, if you look at their insulin dynamics, they're through the roof. So looking at that person's glucose is not really giving you the whole picture. And I think it's probably the same thing in Alzheimer's. And the trouble with Alzheimer's, though, is that some patients seem to have normal glycemic response, but not in the brain. They're sort of normal glycemic in the body, so sometimes these blood tests don't show what you think they would show. Now, you can have a PET scan and you can actually measure the cerebral uptake of glucose, but that's not the kind of test that they run in the average doctor's office. So it's that's really not something the average person is gonna experience. So I think it's almost hard to tell if that's the problem that's going on. I still think some of these dietary and lifestyle interventions would be worth doing, even if you're not sure that that's the problem, because you just might not be able to measure it if it's limited to the brain.
Yeah, very interesting. And going back to the PET scans, in the book you talk about how 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds, when they do the PET scan, it's like the glucose mu test. Was that it? I'm probably getting that wrong. But
I don't know if I know the specific name of the test, but they can measure the cerebral uptake of glucose in people in their 30s and 40s, and it's already less than some of their age-matched peers. And I say peers or controls because these younger people are people that are at risk for Alzheimer's for certain reasons, usually a maternal family history or just a general family history. But so in those people, when they do these studies, they can see that in that young of an age, these people are already starting to have a problem. But I think they're young enough and robust enough that the brain is compensating. They don't have symptoms, so they're asymptomatic. They still have this reduction of cerebral glucose usage, but it's not affecting their day-to-day life. But if they knew at that time that there's already a problem, that's the time to intervene, not when you're 85 and it's too late. You know, I don't think it's ever too late. We'll talk about that in a minute, maybe, but that's the canary in the coal mine. You know, is that early usage, problem with glucose usage.
Yeah, so that's preclinical. So people, they may be a little forgetful, like you talk about in the book, like the senior moments, like you forget your keys and things like that. So for someone in their 30s or 40s, and they might be having an increased frequency of these quote-unquote senior type moments, that's when it's like we need to step back, right, per your recommendations, and really look at our diet and say, you know what, there could be something metabolically going on within the brain. I should change my diet and lifestyle.
Yeah, I think those type of like senior moments, or you forget your keys, you lose your purse, I think those don't happen as much in the 30s and 40s. I think those people are still totally compensating just fine, but maybe in the 50s and 60s, I guess they call that early onset Alzheimer's. I think that is when those moments become more noticeable. but maybe when you're younger, it could just be brain fog, fuzzy thinking. And we know, and probably a lot of the people watching know, that one of the most commonly reported quote-unquote side effects of a low-carb or ketogenic diet is clearing away of brain fog, sharp thought, mental clarity, because the brain is finally getting this premium fuel.
Right.
But it is amazing to me that the process, the pathology of Alzheimer's starts that early.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. And so I think that's the impetus for people to change their diet and go on a relatively low carbohydrate, not necessarily always a ketogenic style diet. For some athletes don't do well on it and so forth, but I think dropping the carbs, especially processed carbs, will benefit the majority of people.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because I think I don't think a strict ketogenic diet is required. Once somebody's illness has progressed to the point where it's really severe or really long-standing, then I do think you need a very dramatic intervention. That's not the time to play around. Yeah. But when somebody is younger and maybe it's just kind of very early, they're having some problems with their thinking, probably just doing low carb and just resetting, glucose metabolism, a little more fatty acid metabolism is probably going to help. But I don't think those people need to be glugging down lots of coconut oil and butter, and so
MCTs and things like that. Exogenous ketones, which I definitely want to talk about towards the end a little bit. But let's go back to insulin in the brain and talk about the mechanisms through which maybe a ketogenic diet would help brain fuel metabolic dysregulation. And so is it because it's insulin? I mean, there's many facets to ketones, and they're pleiotropic and all that, which I would love to explore as well. But is a ketogenic diet affecting cerebral brain metabolism because it's independent of insulin? Is that kind of how we're restoring cellular energy? I
think so. The transport of ketones into the brain is not insulin dependent. It's not glucose dependent. The brain, the reduced glucose metabolism in the brain, for a long time researchers didn't know what was the chicken and what was the egg. Is the glucose not getting into the neurons or into the brain, or is it getting in just fine, but it's not being metabolized properly? And it seems that at first, it's not being metabolized properly. The uptake is fine, but it's not being utilized. And so the problem is not one of supply, it's one of demand. So over time, the demand becomes less, because if the neurons are not using the glucose, there's no need to take up a lot of it. So the disease then progresses to the point where it's actually just not even taking it up efficiently. So the difference with ketones is, even in an Alzheimer's affected brain, ketones will enter the brain and they will be used. They've studied this in animals and they've studied it in humans. They've studied it in people with dementia. So the impairment of glucose metabolism does not affect the ketone metabolism. And the brain still needs glucose. I mean, let's be clear. There's no point at which the brain is going to be able to function with zero glucose. But when you're on a good ketogenic diet, if you're able to provide the brain's fuel with like 40 to 60, if not more, % of its fuel from ketones, I mean, that's a very strict ketogenic diet, but provide a significant proportion of the fuel from ketones, then the requirement for glucose is that much less. And at least, I mean, there's this one mouse study where they showed that not only, when you're on a ketogenic diet, not only is the brain uptake of ketones enhanced, but the brain's use of glucose is actually improved as well. It's like a double whammy. And my guess would be that that's probably because being on that type of diet, the entire metabolic system is better, or is sort of like coming back to life, so to speak. So you calm the inflammation, calm oxidative stress, restore insulin sensitivity a little bit. So then not only are you getting the ketones, you're also getting better glucose metabolism in the brain.
Very interesting. And so that was maybe the network effects induced from the ketones, or like changing the whole metabolic landscape, if you will?
Yeah, I think it's not just the ketones. I think it's the whole process by which a low carb diet would work, because it's so multifactorial.
Insulin, very interesting. I said insulin, but let's talk about IDE, Insulin Degrading Enzyme. I think you mentioned a little bit that there is some sort of dysregulation with this insulin going on. This is this enzyme, I want you to explain it to everyone, that has this role with beta amyloid formation. And maybe let's talk about first what beta amyloid is, and then how it's related to insulin and the IDE.
Okay, so these beta amyloid is a protein that comes from the amyloid precursor protein, which, proteins get chopped up and blended in all kinds of ways. And this amyloid, this precursor protein, gets chopped up into different fragments. And there's a couple of different fragments that are specifically tied to Alzheimer's pathology. And these protein fragments accumulate in the brain. And this is a normal process. I mean, the cleaving of this protein is normal. It happens in everybody. The problem in Alzheimer's is that these proteins accumulate and they build up and they solidify into plaques. And it's these infamous amyloid plaques that you hear about all the time in Alzheimer's. One school of thought says that this is a cause of Alzheimer's, like, oh, these plaques and they're getting in the way. And that's true to an extent, but I don't think they're the fundamental cause of Alzheimer's. They are an exacerbating factor once the cause is already established. I liken it to a fever, where if you're sick and you have an infection, you have a fever. The fever is a defensive mechanism. The fever is your body's way of trying to fight these organisms off. It's trying to raise your core temperature to kill these pathogens. But even though the fever is a protective measure, if the fever gets out of control, if you have 103, 104, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
So then the fever itself becomes a problem. That's what these amyloid plaques are. They may be an initial defensive mechanism that once they get to the point where they've become so abundant in the brain and so sort of sticky and they can't be cleared away, then they become a problem because they literally will block synapses, they will block cellular communication between neurons, and I guess they can become glycated as well, so they can actually become sticky with sugar, and it's just this toxic, sticky mess in the brain. There could be a lot of different things that cause these plaques to build up in the Alzheimer's brain. Yeah. One of the big ones seems to be that there's an enzyme called Insulin Degrading Enzyme, and it sounds like exactly what it is. It is an enzyme that kind of gets rid of insulin after it does its job. When enzymes are in the body doing their job, they can't just stay there forever. When they're done, something has to get rid of them. So insulin degrading enzyme, or IDE, gets rid of insulin, but oddly enough, it also gets rid of these amyloid proteins, which is like fascinating to me. And that's so, there are other substrates for IDE as well, but it's really interesting to me that at least two of them are insulin and these amyloid proteins. So when somebody is hyperinsulinemic, you've got all this insulin in the body. The insulin degrading enzyme is sort of too busy clearing away all the insulin to go after the plaques. So then the plaques are left to accumulate.
So it's like weeds just growing, and they just grow and grow and grow, and then they, in a sense.
It's not, and in the Alzheimer's brain, it doesn't seem to be that they produce more of these amyloid proteins. The problem is they're not cleared away correctly, so they're left to accumulate. There's evidence that one of the genetic types that is most susceptible to Alzheimer's disease produces less insulin degrading enzyme. So that could be, that's a contributing factor. If you are naturally producing less of this enzyme, you're going to have more of these proteins building up in the brain.
Yeah, interesting. So it's kind of like collateral damage in one sense. Like you mentioned, the analogy that comes to mind is we think about cholesterol, like how blood glucose aberrations create hyperinsulinemia, and that creates hepatic de novo lipogenesis, cholesterol forms, and so forth. So it's kind of a similar situation from what I gather with the beta amyloid. Like it's kind of there, but then it spirals out of control.
Yes, I would say that sounds on the money, because it's, like you said, cholesterol is almost like an innocent bystander.
Yeah.
Like every time someone has a heart attack or there's a problem, look, their arteries are all clogged, but the cholesterol was not causing the problem. The cholesterol was there to repair the torn and damaged arteries. So these amyloid plaques, post-mortem, when they do a brain dissection, they can see these plaques. That doesn't mean the plaques were causing this disease to occur. In fact, there are plenty of Alzheimer's patients who don't have extensive plaques, and there's younger people who do have the plaques that don't have clinical signs of Alzheimer's disease. So these plaques are not causing this disease, and it's, at least now, there's more and more research coming to light that this is the case, and there's more researchers saying we're going after the wrong thing. We've wasted a lot of time and a lot of research effort and money on the wrong target. We need to refocus. And the proof is in the pudding. Every single drug that has been developed to go after these plaques has been a failure. It hasn't been a failure. They do reduce plaque formation, but it doesn't have any effect on disease progression. So we reduce the plaque formation, but the Alzheimer's still proceeds unabated. Just like statins with cholesterol, like you were saying, okay, we've lowered the cholesterol, this guy still died of a heart attack.
Right.
Because the cholesterol is not the problem and the amyloid plaques are not the problem. Or they're not the main problem. They are a problem, but they're not the fundamental root cause of the disease.
Right. It's a consequence of this hyperinsulinemia. Partly.
Yeah.
Right. There's other issues too.
Right.
And we talked about it a little bit offline. I know it's not an area of your expertise per se, but you've explored the research enough that I think it's worth discussing that I know Dr. Perlmutter presented this back in like 2009, 2010, that Epstein-Barr and cytomegalovirus and so forth, there's a higher correspondence with this beta amyloid plaque. Have you explored some of that?
I haven't looked at that much, but Perlmutter and also Dr. Dale Bredesen, who's very well known in the Alzheimer's community, he writes a lot about these other kind of infectious roots of Alzheimer's. I don't think that's incorrect, but I don't know if I would call that Alzheimer's. I might call it some other form of dementia. I mean, it's definitely some sort of cognitive impairment being caused by some of these diseases. But, you know, I just think it's so many roads to Rome, right? It could be infectious, could be glucose, could be, you know, so much going on that are all causing the same dysfunction in the brain. I do think the amyloid does seem to have antimicrobial properties. I think it's a protective mechanism that just gets out of control.
Yeah, very interesting. You mentioned this repair and so forth, and that made me think about sleep, like microglial cells and how when you sleep you're really repairing, and that those are these very active cells within our brain. Is there any correlations, Alzheimer's research I haven't looked at very much at all, with circadian rhythm imbalances, sleep impairments, night shift workers, and cognitive decline?
Yes. I can't really comment on the night shift workers, but the sleep dysregulation is a huge issue in Alzheimer's. And it's kind of, again, like chicken and egg, which comes first. People with Alzheimer's disease tend to have a lot of sleep problems and altered circadian rhythms. They also have, you know, problems even telling time, knowing what time it is, even by the daylight and darkness. But is Alzheimer's causing them to have disrupted circadian rhythms, or did they have sleep problems for a long time and it maybe contributed? I think it's both. You know, people with Alzheimer's definitely do have, well, maybe not all, but many of them have a lot of sleep issues. I think poor sleep over the long term can be contributing because, like you said, sleep is fascinating, right? I mean, every single organism that has been studied, or like living organisms, sleeps. I mean, even plants, we could say, have like a sleep relaxation type cycle, but every animal, every mammal sleeps. And we don't know why, but we need sleep. If you do not sleep, you will have major problems. And so there does seem to be one of the things that happens in sleep is clearance of a lot of this metabolic waste. And this is done all the time, but it's upregulated during sleep. And the beta amyloid, I don't know how they know this, but all these researchers' papers indicate that the clearance of these amyloid proteins is greater during sleep than when you're awake.
Wow.
And maybe that has to do with, one would presume when you're sleeping, your insulin levels are lower. You know, even if you eat something before bed, several hours into sleep, your insulin levels will have normalized. Maybe someone who's chronically hyperinsulinemic, they're still going to be high all the time, but maybe they'll be lower than they are during the day when you're in the fed state. But sleep is, I think it can be considered a risk factor. That's when these toxic waste products are cleared out of the central nervous system. Yeah,
and it correlates. I mean, at least epidemiological studies correlate sleep and circadian rhythm perturbations with insulin resistance too. So that's the other component too, is it's multifactorial. It's not just the recycling and cleaning up beta amyloid and other waste products, but if you're causing fundamental insulin sensitivity issues, then you're going to have other components.
Right.
Let's talk about this idea that the brain really needs glucose. And a quote in your book, you said, I'm going to botch this probably, Amy, but you said something to the effect the body is a really good reducer and reuser of fuel. And so if you're eating a higher fat, lower carb diet, your body can make glucose through de novo gluconeogenesis and glycerol and all that. So you don't really, I mean, like we go back to college, like, we went to, college probably around the same time, where it was like, oh, before test you got to carb up and have your pasta and this, and that's probably the worst advice, right?
Well, I think in that case, it probably does give you a quick hit of energy, but quick hit and then it's gone. By the time you're done with that test, you're fried. But no, I think the brain's requirement for glucose does not imply a need for dietary carbohydrate, because like you said, we can make glucose from other things. Now, the diet that I recommend in the book is not a zero carbohydrate diet, so you'll still get carbohydrate from vegetables, small amounts of fruit, dairy products, nuts and seeds. But, the fact is, even if you ate zero carbohydrate or as close to that as you could try to do, your brain would still have glucose. Your body would still have glucose. The body makes it. And anyone out there watching or listening, just know that the body needs glucose, but that doesn't mean you have to eat bagels.
Right. So there's different neurons in the eye and your kidney cells, and there's that really can only metabolically utilize glucose. But
right.
Yeah. So I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's a little off topic, but this idea that gluconeogenesis and ketosis are opposite ends of the spectrum. There's a lot the research that I've read is if you're in ketosis, gluconeogenesis is going on. You're making glucose for those cells that can't utilize ketones.
Right.
So don't be so scared about it. Because people are oh my gosh, can I have a little bit of protein on a ketogenic diet? Doesn't that turn on gluconeogenesis?
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for saying that, because glucose is not toxic. The human body requires glucose. You would be dead if you had no glucose. There is a reason your blood glucose never goes to zero. Glucose is not toxic. The problem is when glucose is too high for too long, too frequently, right? Chronic hyperglycemia. You better be grateful that your body has gluconeogenesis, because, like you said, red blood cells need glucose. Certain cells in the kidneys, or maybe the adrenal glands or something, need glucose. We don't need blood sugar of 250. You can have adequate glucose for those cells within a normal glycemic range, but unfortunately, due to the growing popularity of low-carb and ketogenic diets, there's so much great information out there, but there's probably even more misinformation, or at least incomplete information. And people have come away with this notion that, too much protein spikes insulin and it spikes glucose. It raises it. It doesn't spike it.
Mm-hmm. It's not like having a soda pop.
Yeah.
Totally different.
If it is spiking it to some very significant extent, then there's an issue. And maybe you need some supplementation with insulin sensitizers or medication. But, your blood glucose and insulin going up a little bit in response to protein is what it is supposed to do. And that's a whole other topic, but most of the rise in glucose that we see from protein is not gluconeogenesis. It's not that protein literally that quickly being converted to glucose. That does not happen that quickly. It's glycogen being released from the liver in response to protein, which is exactly what is supposed to happen. That is what a healthy body does. So I don't want people to come away with the notion that they have to limit protein. If you are using a ketogenic diet as medical therapy for something like epilepsy or cancer perhaps, and there's a lot of controversy about that, or even Alzheimer's, you might have a reason to aim for high ketones and limit protein to some extent. But the average person out there who just wants to be healthy and be fit and lose weight, you're actually better off eating a little more protein. Especially the elderly, If we're talking about mostly an older population with dementia, most of them just don't eat enough protein.
Yeah.
They're wasting away, they're sarcopenic, and they need more protein. They don't need a lot of protein, but we haven't defined terms like what is too much protein. Most people do not come close to eating quote unquote too much protein.
Right. Yeah, unless you're a bodybuilder having 350 grams a day, most people are not doing that, can't even fathom
you couldn't,
eating
even
that
if you tried, you couldn't.
It's really hard. I've tried to eat 300 before, and it's really tough.
You'd have to, you kind of have to do it with shakes if you're going to get to that amount. You can't even eat that much real food.
Yeah, you have to be trained. Yeah, and the body, just the physical mechanics of breaking it. You have to be training a lot to really induce that.
Yeah.
But one thing that comes up, by definition, a ketogenic diet, if you're in ketosis, it's very low insulin, right? That's because insulin negatively downregulates hepatic formation of ketones, right? But we know that certain proteins do spike insulin. So is there any protein, and the whole point of this conversation is to talk about Alzheimer's, and there is some hyperinsulinemia or insulin dysregulation in the brain, right? So is there any proteins that come to mind that if someone is really trying to keep insulin down really low due to maybe mild cognitive impairment or some neurologic disorder, what proteins come to mind that maybe, okay, don't eat too much of that? Because I know like you mentioned, some proteins are more insulinogenic than others. I haven't seen any published research on this, but have you come across anything like that?
I haven't looked at the charts in a while, but yeah, I guess dairy protein is one that seems to be very insulinogenic, especially whey, which is why like someone young and fit and lean after a heavy workout, a whey shake is a good idea. A whey shake might not be the best idea for someone who's severely insulin resistant, obese, diabetic, has Alzheimer's. I think also some proteins that are just protein without a lot of fat. So some fishes out there, especially if you're just having like a lean fillet of fish instead of eating more of the whole piece with the fat and the skin. But even that being said, you're still better off eating like a pork chop or chicken or a steak than a bowl of spaghetti.
Yeah.
So it's like a spectrum. I mean, some people might need to be concerned about that insulin rise. I don't want to say spike because it's, you know, like about a small insulin rise from protein, but I think that's not the big fish, you know.
Yeah. It's clinically maybe not as important as it may appear to be, like if you read a journal or something.
That's what I think, and I'm not trying to negate that it's a factor, but I think there's bigger fish to fry, you know. Or if somebody's already doing this type of diet and maybe is not getting the results they wanted, maybe then they want to tweak decreasing protein a little bit and raising fat. But I think to at least start out, I wouldn't worry about the protein.
Really good info. So to kind of summarize, one of the main reasons why you're very excited about the ketogenic diet when it comes to improving brain metabolic health is because it's a low insulin diet, and you're providing the brain with an alternative fuel substrate in the form of a ketone that can the brain can utilize that cellular energy and become more plastic and mobile and get out of this funk of energy devoid, right? So that's kind of what we're talking about. And
I will say, I mean, there's a doctor named Stephen Cunnane out of Canada, and his research group has just done some really fascinating stuff. So we said earlier, kind of, because of this is a cellular energy crisis in the brain, these neurons actually atrophy. And these, you know, axons, like the connections between these neurons are like these kind of long projections that stuff is supposed to go between them, and these axons start to atrophy and they start to recede back into the neuron, making the synapse, like the space between these neurons, is no longer viable. So like cellular communication totally breaks down. And so we think, okay, these cells are atrophying and they're dying, right? They're dead. But they're not dead. And we know they're not dead because when these people get ketones, they have better cognition. If those cells were absolutely dead and completely unresponsive to any type of fuel, there would be no improvement, but there is. So these cells are not really, they're not dead, they're kind of hibernating. Like they're just waiting to come back to life.
Fuel to get going.
Yeah.
So when you said when they get ketones, so this is exogenous ketone supplementation in humans or animals?
Both.
Wow.
They've done it in both. But I mean, we wanted to talk about the exogenous ketones.
Sure.
So I'm so glad, because normally for somebody, you know, who is using this type of diet for general health, for fitness, I think exogenous ketones are not necessary. I'm not going to say they're a waste of time and money, but they're just not necessary. However, I don't like the fact that these things are like now being marketed as a weight loss tool.
Yeah.
I just
it actually
don't know.
slows down fat burning if your body's not adapted. I've read some research on that.
And I can see that, because if the ketones are already there, you have no need to break down your own fat to make them.
Right.
So it can be directly antagonistic, yeah. But for somebody who has Alzheimer's disease, or, you know, let's say Parkinson's, ALS, any other type of neurodegeneration, I think these exogenous ketones can be a godsend. Like, I really think they can be powerful. The problem with them is it's a short-term fix that's fixing the symptom. I think the real powerful intervention is the combination of exogenous ketones and a low-carb or ketogenic diet, because the exogenous ketones have a short half-life. It's only a couple of hours that they're, you know, once they're used up, they're gone. Yeah. Whereas compare that to if you are generating ketones by your own body through your own actions and your own diet all the time, 24/7, even at a low level, you have a little low level of ketones to get into the brain, and you're using this exogenous fuel. So I think that's where the money is. Not the money like, you know,
marketing money. But
yeah, but like the money shot in terms of, you know, actually healing your brain and doing something about your brain. But I think that the ketogenic diet and these other lifestyle interventions that I talk about in my book can actually do some degree of reversing some of this damage that's been done, whereas the exogenous ketones do nothing to stop the progression of this disease. All it's doing is managing the symptoms in the short term, which, let's not discount the importance of that. I mean, especially for somebody in their 70s, in their 80s, you're not going to get those people to change their diet.
Yeah.
You know, maybe you can, but especially someone in a home, in a managed care facility, you can't control the food in there. But even if someone lives with you, somebody who's 85 and has severe dementia, they're not going to wake up all of a sudden one morning and trade in their cereal and English muffin for coconut oil and eggs. So in those people, if there is literally nothing else you can do to help them, get them some ketones. Sneak coconut oil into them however you can. If you prepare food for them, load it up with coconut oil. You know, I think there's other things that are more powerful, but that's better than nothing. And if that's the only thing you can do, do it.
Absolutely. But let's go back a little bit, and I completely agree with that rationale. Is there ever a time when there's high ketones and high glucose? So what I see people doing is they have a cheat meal and they're like, oh, I'm going to negate the, like pasta, spaghetti, whatever. Like, oh, this cheat meal is good because I'm taking my ketones, so I'm still in ketosis. Like, I feel that that's sending mixed messages to the nutrient-sensing enzymes within your body, and what damage is that doing? It seems interesting.
I know, I totally agree. In a healthy, well-regulated body, no, there should not be high glucose and high ketones at the same time, because that is type 1 diabetic ketoacidosis, where you have very, very dangerous levels of ketones and high glucose. On a ketogenic diet, in a healthy, well-regulated body, you'll have elevated ketones and a low blood sugar. Not dangerous low, but low normal. So I agree. I don't know what happens at the cellular level inside the mitochondria when you have a lot of glucose and a lot of ketones. It just seems like energy overload. It sounds like a bad idea to me. I can't say for sure. I don't know, but I mean, normally the body, except in a ketoacidosis state, you're not supposed to have high glucose and high ketones at the same time.
Right.
It just wouldn't really happen. And in somebody who's not on a ketogenic diet or on a low-carb diet, what does the presence of all those ketones do? Are you able to metabolize them properly? Because normally, let's say like the metabolic machinery that normally generates ketones is not up and running. There's all of a sudden there's just ketones inside you. You know, your body's not expecting it. But we could say that of anyone who really takes MCT oil, or who's following a regular standard type high carb diet. Those people still experience the cognitive benefits sometimes.
Sure.
Which, you know, that's the whole point of trying to use them for Alzheimer's, even in somebody who's not doing a low-carb diet. The people watching might know of Dr. Mary Newport, whose husband had Alzheimer's, and he's unfortunately passed away this, I think, 2016? I forget, but he unfortunately did pass away. But she started treating him with coconut oil by putting it on his oatmeal. He was not on a low-carb diet. He was following his regular diet, but she gave him bits of coconut oil throughout the day. And even then, he had noticeable cognitive improvement.
That's amazing.
So I think, I don't think it's the best idea to do it, you know, in someone who's healthy. But if you have compromised cognitive function, then yeah, get those ketones.
Absolutely. And use it as a therapeutic tool. But I think what I inferred from your discussion is like, you really want to focus on changing your diet, because ketones, fish oil, they're supplements, diet is the foundation. We want to work on that. So that's a very important point.
I think I use this in the book, like it's taking these exogenous ketones is like bailing water out of a leaky boat without actually stopping to patch the hole. You're just short term, like managing symptoms, but the actual problem is getting worse. Like these exogenous ketones are great as a little band-aid, but they're not actually fixing the problem.
And so that's where dietary changes kind of reprogram your metabolic machinery, induce mitochondrial biogenesis, and so on.
Right.
What aspect of the whole network improvement induced through the ketones are you most excited about? Because there's a whole epigenetic discussion, and beta-hydroxybutyrate being a histone deacetylase inhibitor, and there's a million things that get me so excited that it's not just about like, oh, you're manipulating your macronutrients. There's other key network, and we have a cat walking around, key network and signaling molecules that are improved. Amy, what gets you so excited about that?
I mean, for me, I just think even the notion that ketones can fuel the brain, even an Alzheimer's damaged brain can still have better cognitive function in the presence of ketones. I mean, that to me is I don't know why that information isn't being brought to the Alzheimer's community, to the loved ones and caregivers of people with dementia. That's why I wrote the book, because this information is all over the scientific literature. These people don't know about it. They've never heard type 3 diabetes or diabetes of the brain. They don't know. And I don't know that this is, it's not a magical cure. I mean, nobody should get that impression, but it can be effective. There are 0 effective pharmaceutical drugs for this condition. The standard of care is that there is no standard of care. The standard of care is get your affairs in order. You know, this is a progressive, irreversible condition. I don't know why even the mere idea that Alzheimer's is a fuel problem, it's an energy crisis in the brain, and there's ways around this. I don't know why that's not being talked about more. Right. But it's kind of the same thing like with type 2 diabetes. It's starting to change now, but why aren't people banging the low-carb drum harder? You know, you have a problem with chronically high blood sugar. There could be a lot of things contributing, maybe we're not sure. Let's start with a big elephant in the room and get the carbohydrate out of your diet. That's one big way to lower the blood sugar. So, okay, Alzheimer's disease, your brain is not metabolizing glucose properly. Let's give it a fuel it does metabolize properly. Like, end of story. I don't know why this isn't, why isn't this out there? But hopefully my book is going to get it out there.
Absolutely.
And there's more to it. I mean, I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but that's the starting point. You know?
Is changing the diet, because it's a big lever, right? A small hinge that swings big doors, as they say.
Right. It's like one intervention, change the diet, that has multiple effects throughout the body and obviously the brain. Yeah, beautifully said. And let's kind of summarize with some other effects, other lifestyle changes, I should say, that have a favorable effect on inducing, brain resilience, plasticity, preventing cognitive decline. Things that you talk about in the book: learning an instrument, de-stressing. The sense of community and social isolation is something that's unique and has emerging as like a risk factor and so forth. What other things kind of pop into your mind that you want to discuss? Definitely exercise. Yeah. You know, it's like totally cliche at this point. Oh, diet and exercise, but it's because it's true. It works. Exercise is really good for brain plasticity. There's something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is kind of this protein, I think it's a protein, that it helps neurogenesis. Like we used to think that you could not generate new neurons in the brain. You can. And you can keep the ones you have in active working order, but giving them a reason to stay active. You know, get out there, exercise, walk, especially if you can be in nature, get some stimulation by the greenery and the fresh air. And let's not forget how good exercise is for improving the whole insulin sensitivity system and glucose dynamics. I mean, I think that goes hand in hand. We talked about sleep. Stress, I think they have found a lot of Alzheimer's patients have been under chronic stress for a long time. You know, a lot of them, Alzheimer's strikes everybody. It's an equal opportunity disease, so to speak, but a lot of type A type people get this. People that were like, go, 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 always on, always working, and they never sort of took time to recharge. Yeah. And we do that at our peril. You know, we have, we're in this society where like it's all the more you can do and be productive and keep churning out content and keep working and
hustle.
Yeah, like the hustle, and nobody celebrates, I'm just gonna go take the day off and sit around and do nothing.
Right. It's really interesting. Along those lines, so meditation, does that come up like with people that have Alzheimer's, or was more of a preventative strategy?
Good question. Dale Bredesen has a pretty fascinating study out where he's done a little bit of reversing Alzheimer's and subjective cognitive impairment, and his protocol is multifactorial, but it includes some form of meditation. I mean, it includes, you know, low glycemic diet, MCT oil, getting vitamin and micronutrient replete. There's a lot of supplementation in it. It includes, I want to say, a 12-hour daily fast. So between dinner one night and breakfast the next morning, you go at least 12 hours. And end dinner at least 2 or 3 hours before you go to sleep. Try to get 8 hours of sleep. So it's multifactorial, but one of the facets of his program was some type of meditation, whether it's yoga, Pilates, or whatever someone finds relaxing like that. As for whether it's more preventive, I don't know. I think it could be, in terms of it's just one more of those like de-stressing activities.
Yeah, very interesting. Have you dove into the research on some of the neuronal changes associated with meditation personally?
I have not, because to be honest with you and your audience, I do not like meditation.
Is that right?
I'm just not a fan.
So you just like to go out and do your exercise and get out in nature? Is that kind of your deal?
I think for me, my meditation is walking outside, but not like in a city, in an urban big area. I live near a place where there's a really nice wooded trail near a lake.
Cool.
And being out there is my meditation. Cooking is my meditation. I think whatever it is that calms you and gives you joy could be meditation. But I don't know, because I haven't looked in terms of like the actual changes. There may be something too, like sitting quietly and getting centered and all that. I don't know.
Well, no, I mean, there is, I think, different, sitting on the cushion is, you know, is a different technique than like Shinrin Roku, I think they call it in Japanese, where they have like forest bathing, where people literally, they studied folks that walk in an urban, like a city, where there's taxi cabs and fire trucks and all that sort of stuff, and then walk for the same amount of time in a nature reserve, and there's a different change in the parasympathetic nervous system and brain chemistry. So I think you're onto something. And you know, just the idea that like sitting on a cushion for 20 minutes twice a day may not work for your brain. It doesn't mean that you know, you can get a lot of benefit from being out in nature is the thing. So personalize your stress reduction therapy is what I was trying to say.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think find something that works for you. Like if like for me, I really, really don't like yoga. Yoga stresses me out. It's doing the opposite of what it's supposed to do. So I need to find some other activity that I actually do unwind and feel calm in.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we have a few final questions, and one of them was about exercise, so I'll have a little bit more context there. But Amy, before we kind of transition a little bit to some final questions here, anything about the book that we didn't really talk about that you want to share with viewers?
I guess the book is kind of interesting in that the whole first section is devoted to Alzheimer's origins and pathology and kind of what's going on. And much of the rest of the book is explaining why a low-carb diet is safe.
Yeah.
Because probably most of your fans are not scared of eating butter and eating red meat and fatty meats anymore, but a lot of people are, especially the people with Alzheimer's who are a little bit older. You know, they're even from the generation where the doctor was always right, and you know, the doctor said I need to be on a low cholesterol, low fat diet, or just having you know, gotten most of their nutritional information in the 60s or so, or the 50s. They were really the first generation that was indoctrinated with this like low saturated fat, you know, don't eat red meat. And so a lot of the book is explaining why not only is this safe to do, but it could actually be really, really beneficial, if not life-saving, in a way. We didn't talk about the ApoE4 gene. Do you want to talk about that real quick?
That's awesome. Yeah, I would love to.
The biggest genetic risk factor for Alzheimer's is the ApoE4 genotype. And this gene does not cause Alzheimer's. It is a risk factor. It increases susceptibility in the context of the high-carb diet and the sedentary lifestyle. ApoE, this E4 genotype, there's less of this in populations with a longer history of grain-based agriculture, whether that's like in parts of Asia where they were eating rice, or they say Southern Europe where it was wheat, even among like the Maya and Mesoamerica where they're eating a lot more corn. I don't know that that's widely accepted, but that's in the, you know, in the scientific literature that eating a higher carbohydrate diet may have selected against this genotype. So the people that still have this genotype in today's day and age are not suited for the high carb diet.
Now, which allele, sorry, the 4-4 allele? So if you have that allele, then you should go, or...
4-4 is the worst, but even if you're heterozygous, you could be like 3-4, 2-4. If you have 1-4 allele, it increases your susceptibility, and if you have 2, it's very significantly increased. But
so
there are people who are homozygous 4-4 that don't develop Alzheimer's, and most people with Alzheimer's are not 4-4s. So we know that this doesn't cause it, and you can absolutely get Alzheimer's with some other genotype. And if you are a 4-4, it is not a death sentence that you're going to get this. You have to mitigate your risk, just like anything else. So I think if you're a 4-4, you probably have more reason than anybody else to be strict about your diet and lifestyle. But I don't think anyone should come away feeling like, oh, I'm a 4-4, there's nothing I can do.
Well, you know what's funny about that is on the reports from like Berkeley Heart Labs and SpectraCell and these other reports, usually that's associated with like a blood lipid panel. They're like, oh yeah, we'll throw on your ApoE genotype. And they'll say, I believe, I could be wrong here, but on the 4-4, it'll say like a low-fat diet is recommended. So I could be totally wrong here, but I do remember reading that, and so because I'm like, oh, I guess you're poor fat metabolizer. So this is really good information to know.
And you know, maybe a low-fat diet does work for some of them if it's not super high in refined concentrated carbohydrates. If we're talking about mostly low glycemic plants, nuts and seeds, well, nuts and seeds are fatty, but I could see that potentially working, because if it's still a low insulinogenic diet, so if they're just not eating bread and pasta, if they're eating a lot more vegetables, even fruit, low-fat meats, I could see that working. But the E4, it is associated with a lot of lipid abnormalities. They tend to have, well, sometimes really high cholesterol. That could also be another factor by which this affects Alzheimer's. It's actually a problem with cholesterol transport into the brain. And we know the brain is loaded with cholesterol. The brain is like built out of cholesterol. If you are not getting enough cholesterol to the brain, or for some reason the brain itself is not synthesizing enough cholesterol, it's a disaster. So statin drugs, I think, are an absolute disaster for Alzheimer's disease. I think they are probably contributing significantly to the disease. Cholesterol is so important for healthy cognition that if you are taking a drug that deliberately impairs the body's ability to create cholesterol, that is bad news for the brain.
And it's interesting, so that HMG-CoA reductase enzyme that's involved in the cholesterol synthesis is also involved in hepatic ketogenesis as well. So I'm wondering too, what sort of relationship, I haven't looked exactly at that pathway in a little while, but I know there's some correlation there. So if you're suppressing cholesterol biogenesis, are you affecting ketone production? Too, it's kind of interesting to think about. But Amy, going back a little bit to what you said, so these older folks that are getting, well, baby boomers, right? And may have mild cognitive impairment, and they were taught that fat was the devil and so forth. Do you ever catch yourself, because I catch myself sometimes, like when I'm putting butter in my coffee, like there's just that small little guy on my shoulder saying, oh, fat is, does that ever come to that fat's bad? Or are you so inundated that you're like, because I can see how someone who grew up in that era was taught that fat is bad. There's still some hesitation somewhere deep down in them.
Oh, definitely. They're going to have a lot of hesitation. For those people, all I can say is what you're doing now isn't working. Your brain is literally running on borrowed time at this point. You are already in the disease progression. You got to nip it in the bud. And there's no drugs to help you. You're on your own. You have to do something yourself. I mean, all I can say to those people who are still scared of this is there are hundreds, if not thousands at this point, of medical doctors, medical legitimate doctors, using this not only for their patients, but for themselves. They eat this way. They're not afraid of it because they know the science. They know the biochemistry. Do I think that everybody has to eat a high-fat diet? No, but I think it can be very therapeutic for a lot of people. I don't really get scared of it anymore, although, to be honest, I am eating a little bit less fat these days for weight control. I had been a little bit taken by I can eat as much fat as I want as long as I eat low carb, and it's not really true. You can actually gain body fat while you're in ketosis if you are eating an extraordinary amount of fat, an extraordinary amount of total calories. I wish that wasn't true. It sounds great. It's like, just eat as much fat as you want, just don't eat carbs. It doesn't work that way.
Interesting.
Maybe for some people it does. So I am eating less fat, but it's not because I think the fat is harmful. I'm actually just trying to lose weight.
Right. So were you eating more meals per day? Like what was, what's changed then compared to now?
I'm adding a lot less extra fat to things. So I'll still eat a nice fatty steak or a burger or a pork chop, but I won't bring the bottle of olive oil to the table so I can just pour more, eat some, pour more. I've cut out a lot of dairy fat. I found that's where I was getting a lot of excess calories that I didn't even realize, just adding the extra fat that I don't really need.
From the cheese and whatnot, eh?
From cheese and just from fat, from butter, from coconut oil. And it's, fat is not bad, but there is a point, where if you're trying to lose weight, then too much.
Yeah. So, I mean, I asked personally because I made a mistake early on in the ketogenic journey where I just substituted all my carbs for fat and was still having the same number of meals, and it wasn't working out for me.
Yeah.
Because fat takes a longer time for the gut to process and things like that. So I was just personally curious to hear your side of the story. And I think that is interesting, you know, when a lot of people get into it, they're like coconut oil on everything, ghee on everything, and it's like, that is just too much calories, right? At some level, right? So that's kind of interesting.
And I think it works for some people, which is why it's so popular, but I think some people find, or at least initially, when you're making the transition into this diet, that tends to work. You can eat a limited fat, but there comes a point where if you hit a stall or a weight loss plateau, that's probably the factor, it's just too much fat.
To switch it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I love where this conversation is going because the first of the final 4 questions is your morning routine. So you wrote this great book, you do a lot of research, you're very active on your blog, Amy. What do you do during the first couple hours every day?
Do as I say, not as I do. I don't have a morning routine. I get up and my routine is I have to have coffee immediately or I'm not human. I wish that wasn't the case, but I'm a coffee addict. I'm born and raised in New York City. That's just the way it is.
How do you do your coffee?
I do stevia, and I do, right now I'm actually using half and half because I'm trying to cut out some extra fat, but normally I would do cream. I do a little bit of dairy in that form. I don't put I used to put coconut oil in it, I don't anymore. I didn't find that it was giving me any sort of boost that I could notice. I try when I can, when it's nice out, to walk first thing in the morning too. If I'm gonna do a long walk, I try to get it done early. And I feel like just getting out and getting in the daylight, even if it's overcast, just makes me feel better, wakes me up. If I'm not walking, I'll go to the gym. And then I do that fasted, but with the coffee and the cream, and maybe I'll have a bite of something before I go, but I don't really eat a big meal. I usually, when I come back from the gym or from a walk, I tend to have a big meal. Then I work for a couple of hours and eat again. But my morning routine is not really a morning routine. It's I wish I was more systematic about things, but
it helps. Yeah, I've noticed since there's a great book called Triggers by Marshall Goldsmith, and he talks about morning and evening routines. If folks are interested in learning more about that, so let's talk about exercise. So if you could only do one exercise, or for your brain, what exercise? We talked a little bit about this BDNF, that fertilizer for brain cells. What exercise would you do and why?
Oh, good question. For BDNF, I feel like you maybe want to do something more intense, something high intensity. So that could be sprinting, it could be lifting, whatever you can get to that you feel like you're doing something intense. I think walking is really one of the most beneficial things to do. I mean, maybe it's not enough though. You really need a reason to make your body stronger, to make your cognition stronger, to make yourself just more robust in general. And I think walking is good for maintenance. I don't think if you're in a hole, walking is not going to get you out of it. I think you need a little more. If you're already doing well, walking can keep that going. So I would just say anything intense, whether that's going to be like, weightlifting with intensity or sprinting or rowing or some type of, more aerobic activity, but doing it at a high level. Okay, and so I haven't looked at the research. So the intensity is key to induce elevations in BDNF? I could be wrong about that. It makes sense. I think they've done that. Walking does it too. I mean, any activity will do it. Right. So I think the message is to just get active, and for somebody with Alzheimer's who is of advanced disease, where like they can't lift weights, or they can't even jog or something. Maybe they can walk, but the pace at which they're going to walk is maybe not going to generate anything. I don't want people watching this to come away with the thought that you have to exercise, or you have to fast, or you have to meditate. Those are great. Those are extras. I think the #1 place to start is with the diet. If you can exercise, it's a bonus and it's really important. But if you can't, don't feel like you should well, I can't exercise, so this whole thing is a waste of time. I'm not going to bother. Like, no, do what you can. If you can change the diet, do it. If you can fast, do it. But don't feel like it's a losing proposition if you can't do all of it. Yeah, that's a really good point for people to kind of hear that. And it makes sense on the intensity on the BDNF. So if you're, evolutionary purposes or thinking from that standpoint, a saber-toothed tiger, or you run into a cave and you have to run out and you get that intensity, then your brain is going to remember, like, don't go there at this time of the day, or be wary of that sound, or so forth. Yeah. Which is really interesting. And I thought about it earlier and I forgot to mention it. There were some studies that came out recently that show that people that exercise were
get like exposure to a lot of traffic and like maybe you run during rush hour, there's a higher correlation with plaque in the brain and so forth. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Again, not to deter people from exercising, but just be aware, like if you're running near a freeway, you might want to run away from the freeway or go in nature, like you were saying.
If you can, I mean, maybe like running near a freeway is better than not running at all, but maybe it's not as good as running in a quiet, clean place.
Beautifully said. Yeah. Fantastic. All right, so if you were going to be stranded on a desert island, you can only bring one herb, nutrient, botanical, or whole food. Vitamin D and omega-3s are covered. What are you bringing, Amy?
One out of all of that, or?
Well, just anything. So maybe it's some people say curcumin, probiotics. Some people say rosemary, ginger. If there's just one thing that you just...
Well, you did say a food product, so I would say beef, preferably grass-fed, but if not, I mean, beef, you're going to get iron, zinc, B12, you know, selenium. You're going to get a pretty broad array of nutrients just from that. There might be some shortfalls, but, you know, is curcumin going to give you all that?
Probably not. Yeah. And then the creatine in the meat. There's some good research about creatine in the brain.
Ah.
Yeah.
I'm not up on that, but...
Yeah, just, you know, creatine has been in the bodybuilding space for a while, to, you know, for hypertrophy and performance. But interestingly, there's some good research in using creatine for cognitive health. So that's kind of very fascinating stuff.
I'm going to have to look at that, yeah.
So final question here, Amy, if you were to bump shoulders with a political figure in an elevator of sorts, and they turned to you and said, oh my gosh, you wrote this great book, you've been studying the brain and nutrition, tell me something I should know, maybe I can influence policy around. What would you want them to know when it comes to nutrition, dietary advice, and so forth?
A politician in the U.S.?
Or abroad.
If I could influence policy in the U.S., I would say immediately end grain subsidies. Because the minute we do that, now I could be wrong, I'm not a politician, I'm not an economist, but the minute we end grain subsidies in the US at least, the price disparity between some of these whole, real, unprocessed foods and the processed grains is going to become much less, because there's a reason grass-fed steak and wild-caught fish and pastured poultry and all that cost a zillion times more than a box of cornflakes. When we stop subsidizing, you know, corn and wheat in this country, be prepared to pay, I don't know, $10 a box for Frosted Flakes. And then maybe, you know, $8.99 a pound for beef doesn't look so bad. Yeah. That's if brilliant. I could do it.
That was quick, too. You didn't even have to think about that. I
well,
love
there's probably a better answer, but that's the first one off the top of my head.
That's awesome. Amy, it's been fun chatting with you.
You
I
too.
commend
Thanks
you for
so
all
much.
your great work. The book is
you.
really fantastic. So let's let everyone know when the book's available, the title, and then also your blog. I think you have a lot of great information on your blog people should learn about.
The book is called The Alzheimer's Antidote. It's coming out March 24th, but it's available for pre-order now. My blog is Tuit Nutrition, T-U-I-T, nutrition.com, and it's kind of just a blog now. There's not really a lot of content, but I'm going to be revising it soon to cater more to people who are new to this, to have general, like, quick get start guide to low carb, you know, special supplements, whether it's for Alzheimer's or for low carb. I want to be a better resource for that. Right now, I feel like my blog is more for people that are already doing this and already know a lot about it.
Sure. Well, Amy, it's a fantastic book. Like I said, on the airplane on the way over here, we're in Baltimore, by the way, folks. I was really blown away by all the content that you have on there. So a lot of books now, what I've noticed is there's like a little bit of content and then a bunch of recipes, and it's all fluff. Guys, this is really detailed, really cutting edge stuff. I would highly recommend checking it out. I learned it, I mean, I studied this stuff and interviewed over 200 people. Tons of things that I didn't know that I learned from the book. So please click the link below this video. You'll get direct access to Amy's book on Amazon and Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And I appreciate you guys tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next video.